I look back over nearly 70 years, it's difficult to recapture the sense of adventure and discovery, and even refuge, that the Freddy books brought to me when first I read them. But reacquainting with the books in my elder days, I see things which I did not perceive the first time around. I do not remember many of the books in much detail, just have a vague recollection of the theme, and perhaps one or more specific highlights. I have refreshed my memory through latter-day rereadings commencing in 1994 with one book, resuming after a jump to 2008 when I attended my first Friends of Freddy convention. I owe considerable thanks to Michael Cart, who readily solved some mysteries for me. The Freddy series opens with Charles the Rooster heading out reluctantly before dawn one cold morning to crow, under threat of being fricasseed with baking powder biscuit for Sunday dinner if he overslept again. This is our first instance of the Freddy book's frankness about animals ending up as meals for humans. In the second book, Freddy is off with other animals to the North Pole. Ferdinand the Crow arrives back at the bean farm, reporting that the expedition was marooned on an iceberg, then picked up by the crew of a whaling ship. The Crow is uneasy at how some of the sailors looked greedily at Freddy. Ferdinand overheard the ominous Captain Hooker talking with the ship's mate, debating whether Freddy would go better as pig's knuckles and sauerkraut, or chops with a bit of apple. Then Ferdinand saw them lick their lips and grin. Perhaps the most callous mention of an animal's vulnerability comes in Freddy Plays Football, when our pig was on the lam after taking off with some cash, for valid but undisclosed reasons. Mr. Bean is so mad he puts out a wanted poster offering a reward for Freddy's capture. Freddy's pal Jinx brings a copy of the poster to Freddy in hiding. Boy, is Mr. Bean sore, Jinx tells him. It's the sausage factory for you, kid, if they catch you. To the best of my recollection, my first Freddy book was Freddy the Detective, which I think came into my hands in late 1953 when I was in grade 4. This was thanks to the courteous assistance of a librarian at my neighborhood branch library, which is to be my sole supplier of Freddy reads for the next 3 years. The book was an excellent introduction to the world of Freddy, giving an overview of the Bean Farm and setting out a wide range of major and recurring characters. Freddy modeled himself as a detective after Sherlock Holmes, the great sleuth of English fiction. There are both similarities and differences between the two series of stories, apart from the obvious difference that Holmes was a human, Freddy a pig. A key similarity was that both pig and man had skilled illustrators enhancing the accounts of their exploits, establishing what they looked like in the minds of their readers. Kurt Wiese drew the Freddy picture. The initials SP below Holmes's leg means that that picture was drawn by Sidney Paget, who began illustrating Holmes stories from the start. The famed deerstalker hat does not appear in the text of any of the Holmes stories. Paget invented it as part of Holmes's pictorial attire. Wiese knew that it would endorse Freddy as a serious crime fighter. Imagine for a shuddering moment how Freddy might have looked as a detective at the pen of Freddy Goes to Florida's original illustrator, No, even at the worst of his female disguises, Freddy would have had a better sense of clothing and makeup. Then there are the villains. Detectives spend their careers thwarting them, putting them away. To build interest in an ongoing series, it is useful to bring in a kind of supervillain who might successfully resist, and perhaps even threaten to overcome, the detective. In the Holmes stories, the sleuth of 221B Baker Street found the malignant mathematician Professor Moriarty opposing him, and for a while seeming to have put an end to him. It is in Freddy the Detective that we first meet the wily old rat Simon. He will turn up again and again throughout the Freddy series with new schemes to disrupt law and order on the Bean Farm and beyond. Sidekicks are a central but subsidiary character in detective stories. Someone who becomes the detective's prime conversational partner, or carries a bit of the action so that the main character is not on display all the time. Sherlock Holmes had Dr. Watson from the start. Stolid, unimaginative, but loyal, dependable, intelligent, and brave. And his army revolver came in useful at times. As a sidekick for Freddy, we tend to think of Jinx, Freddy's companion on the trail, the cat of action, the hit cat. But in a departure from the Holmes formula, Freddy has a second sidekick. And that is Mrs. Wiggins, the partner back in the office, the deep thinker, the detective of common sense. But to generalize a bit, where have we also seen this combination of a detective of massive bulk but considerable intellect, and a fast-talking, wisecracking, streetwise tough guy not afraid to mix it with baddies? That's right, the housebound NERO WOLFE, solving crime and tending to his orchids, while his ebullient assistant Archie Goodwin runs errands and brings in clues and suspects. NERO and Archie did not come on the scene until 1934, with the first NERO WOLFE mystery, FER-DE-LANCE. By then, Freddy and Mrs. Wiggins and Jinx had been battling crime for 2 years. What more evidence do we need? NERO WOLFE is a blend of Mrs. Wiggins and of Freddy when thinking back in his pig pen, while Jinx clearly inspired Archie Goodwin. I was born in England, and had I remained there, it is unlikely that I would ever have encountered the Freddy books. Michael Cart has advised me that only 4 were published in Britain, from 1949 to 1952, with no indication of reprintings. Coming to Canada in early 1946 at the age of 2 years and 2 months involved a journey of about 9 days and 7,000 miles, ending up at Calgary in Western Canada. And there I was to grow up in a culture which made me a sucker for a couple of the Freddy books. The 2 cowboy-oriented books Walter Brooks turned out in back-to-back publications in 1950 and 1951 slipped the phenomenon I call the Western craze into the Freddy stories. Growing up in Calgary, I had become attuned to this mindset, and recalled thinking it was a really neat idea when Freddy had the horse Cy teach him how to ride. The Western craze had originated much earlier, beginning in a genuine fascination with America's frontier heritage, but over time that interest was promoted and distorted by novelists who loved to set exaggerated fiction back in more exciting, less restrained times. That was reflected early in the 1965 hit movie Cat Ballou, when the newly minted schoolteacher Catherine Ballou was returning home to the West. On the train, this kid raised on a ranch is noted reading an exciting paperback novel, Kid Shalene and the Massacre at Whiskey Slide. But that Old West had already transited out, as became clear later in the movie when Cat and her gang seek refuge in a haven for old desperados, only to be turned away because the former tough guys now exist peacefully on the sufferance of the nearby town and don't want to risk losing that tolerance. The Old West got a boost when Hollywood in its early days realized the mythical bygone era offered infinite opportunities for exciting good guy, bad guy dramas and incredible potential for chase scenes, still a movie staple, far evolved from gun-toting posses chasing after the bandits. The movies brought in singing cowboys, and it got so that to go over as a band it was a good idea to dress up in Western attire and play a style of music called Western Swing, like this 1936 band in Denver. Does anyone recognize the cowboy band leader circled in red? Woody Guthrie, later famous as a singer-songwriter of folk music. In the 40s, these hard-bitten sons of the musical range called the Saddlemen were popular. Later to become famous as the rock and roll founding Bill Haley and his Comets. Walter Brooks was not the only popular author who slipped a Western theme into a book series. The NERO WOLFE detective series was well established by 1960, when Rex Stout wrote a novella entitled The Rodeo Murder, which appeared in a 3-story anthology called 3 at Wolfe's Door. The next year, Argosy magazine published the novella as The Penthouse Murder. Thereafter, it reverted to the original title. Either title was appropriate. The murder took place in a New York City penthouse, where a group of competitors were gathered for the World Championship Rodeo taking place in Madison Square Garden. In 1969, Stout followed that up with a full novel, where NERO WOLFE violated his rule against going outside his brownstone mansion in order to head for Montana to solve a murder. He had to go, lest Archie Goodwin go down for a murder he did not commit. I think it was in this book that we learned one of the characters had competed at the Calgary Stampede and won a championship belt. Bringing in an established name like that introduces a note of authenticity and establishes a character's standing in a genre. Michael Crichton did the same thing in Jurassic Park, where it is casually mentioned that Dr. Alan Grant, a paleontologist, had worked for a while up in Alberta at Drumheller's Tyrrell Museum, soon to gain the distinction of being renamed the Royal Tyrrell Museum. Calgary, still often referred to as Cowtown, is set at the eastern edge of what we call the foothills to the Rocky Mountains, at the junction of 2 rivers flowing from those peaks. For several thousand years it had been a gathering spot for indigenous tribes. A nice location at that time, with good fishing, good hunting. In 1875, the Northwest Mounted Police arrived to suppress the whiskey trade flowing up from Montana and to establish and enforce law and order. They erected this fort alongside one of the rivers, and within a couple of years it was named Fort Calgary, after a place name in Scotland. There is no agreement on what the Gaelic name means. Then in 1883, the Canadian Pacific Railway reached Calgary, and generous land use grants by the federal government encouraged cattle ranching in the surrounding plains. Calgary quickly became the center for a substantial cattle raising and meat packing industry. In 1912, an American cowboy entertainer named Guy Wydick, originally from Rochester, New York, arrived in Calgary and talked 4 prominent cattlemen into sponsoring a rodeo as a tribute to the old-time Wild West. Note the date, 1912. Only 18 years after the fictional Cat Ballou depicted a West in which the old freebooting, free-shooting days were on the way out. Calgary's Old West was genuine, but not wild. That's why we had the Mounties. Wydick called the show a stampede, which sounds ever so much more exciting than rodeo. The show was a success, but did not become an annual event until 1923, after Wydick got talking with the head guy at an established Calgary agricultural and industrial exhibition. They merged, put on a stampede and exhibition. But Wydick also talked residents into dressing up Western for the week, and persuaded business owners to decorate their premises accordingly. That went over well, and the event grew into the stampede culture I came to in 1946. Although at 2 years old, I wasn't all that aware or interested for a while. But 2 years later, the stampede culture in Calgary got a supercharge from, of all places, Toronto. Calgary had a football team named the Stampeders, and in 1948 they won the Western Canada Championship, which entitled them to travel to Toronto to play the Eastern champions for the Grey Cup, symbol of football supremacy in Canada. A group of enthusiastic supporters decided to go along, some by air, some by train. They took with them their Western attire. Some also took along their horses, by train I assume, who bore highly decorative tack. Here you see a bunch of them riding along a Toronto street. Note the white hats, already by then an iconic symbol of Calgary. There were also chuck wagons, handing out free flapjacks, including from the steps of Toronto City Hall. Calgary won. The Calgary players and fans went berserk. Here we see the president of the Stampeders on the left, and a player named Woody Strode holding the cherished Grey Cup. Woody was an American from Los Angeles who had recently come up to Canada to play. He was 34 and had lost his best playing years to the Second World War, but he was still pretty good and gave excellent service in the game. But it was in the post-game celebrations that Woody made a significant contribution to what became the foundation of Canada's annual football classic, and in a way consistent with Calgary's cowboy ethic. A lot of the celebrants gathered on the street in front of the Royal York Hotel, on the left side here, across from Toronto's Union Station, whooping it up. On a sudden whim, Woody Strode borrowed a horse from a friend amongst the supporters, then with the friend holding the door open, rode in, went up the steps to the main hall, and proceeded to ride about the lobby to an enthusiastic audience. Then he wheeled his horse, let out a war whoop, and departed to tremendous applause. There may have been other Calgary riders who followed suit, as a prominent Toronto sports columnist mentioned other horses in the hall, with the hotel staff being good-natured about it and the riders declining to ride into the elevators. There are, unfortunately, no known photographs of the scene. This capped a weekend of Western-themed fun and frolic in Toronto, which turned our annual Grey Cup game into a national celebration, which continues to this day. Woody Strode's football career was ended by injury the next year, and he returned to the States, where he got into acting. He played a number of prominent roles, but to me he is memorable for the 1962 Western The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, playing Pompey, Rancher Tom Doniphan's hired hand and backup, and ultimately his fire-braving rescuer. Here Strode is standing inside the town saloon alongside Andy Devine, playing the weak lawman Link Appleyard. That was the atmosphere I grew up in, so it's not surprising to see me in my Calgary backyard dressed Western. This would have been in the summer of 1950, just before I started school. One attraction the Stampede offered kids like me was an exciting midway, with features like the Dodgem cars. Here's me the next year. I can date it because this was taken by a sidewalk photographer who always stood outside the Hudson's Bay store in downtown Calgary. The lady on the right is my mother, with a stroller containing my younger brother, then just turned 2. Note the 6-gun, with a roll of exploding caps that gave a bang and the smell of gunpowder. I loved the midway, but I never did go to the rodeo at the Stampede, except for a special one later that year. In October, the heir to the throne, Princess Elizabeth, and her husband, began a cross-country tour of Canada. At Calgary, they got a special mini-stampede. It was biting cold, and there'd been a light snowfall as the royal couple arrived in a western stagecoach. They were well wrapped. I know about the weather because I was one of thousands of school kids who had the afternoon off to attend, mandatorily. So I'm out there somewhere in the grandstand. Both being excellent riders, I presume the Royals enjoyed the show, despite the weather. In later years, the husband was heard to complain that every time they visited Calgary, he got another of those damn white hats. Aww. The Western craze was phony, but for me it was a lot of fun. And you can see why I felt right at home in the 2 Freddy Western books. I have already said that in later years I usually recall only the theme, perhaps a few highlights, of the stories. Seeing Kurt Visa's drawings awakened many memories from long ago. This sketch of the perfume counter duel between Freddy and Cal Flint generated one of those awakenings of memory, which I accompanied by gasping, "How could I have forgotten that?" In the days of my youth, I didn't think of the Freddy books as affording me a kind of window into the United States. The country to the south of me I didn't know much about. It wasn't any big explanatory exposition. It was just picking up bits of background or story details that introduced me to things I did not know. For instance, I don't know if I'd ever heard of Florida when I read about Freddy and the other animals going there. I certainly had not heard about the Everglades and the alligators. About a year or 2 later, when I started learning in school about the Mayas and the Aztecs and the Incas and the conquistadores, I recognized a couple of names. Oh yeah, Ponce de Leon. Heard about him in that Freddy book. And Balboa. He was the guy who lost the boot, and nearly what went inside it, to the grandfather of all the alligators. On the way to Florida, the animals stopped off at Washington, D.C. to see the sights. They were taken in hand by 3 senators. A band was arranged to lead them through the streets and over to the White House, where they got to shake hands with the president. A president? We had a queen over in England, and a local representative called a governor-general. At that time, the starchily formal Vincent Massey, the first Canadian in the post. A British diplomat said of him, "Terribly decent chap, Vincent, but he does make one feel a bit of a savage." Shake hands with a bunch of animals? No way. And our senators were and are appointed, and need not bother with politicking. The band brought in to accompany the animals through the streets of Washington started off by playing Marching Through Georgia. I was intrigued by the title. As a kid growing up in a military setting, any mention of marching caught my attention. But I'd never heard of the tune, and had no context for it. Didn't know what Georgia was. Over the years that followed, I learned considerably more about the song. In recent years, I recalled faintly a sequence in one book involving a Colonel Yancey and a sort of Confederacy holdover. Michael Cart corrected me. There were 2 books, the story of Reginald and Freddy the Pied Piper. The Colonel, I was slightly off on the spelling but close enough on the sound, was a Confederate officer who never returned from war. After the slaves left following the surrender, the animals took over the plantation, remaining staunch Confederates. The photograph shows General Sherman standing by the breech of a cannon at Federal Fort No. 7, Atlanta, Georgia, 1864, before the March to the Sea began. Children can react to individual scenes or sequences in a book according to their own experiences. Like most libraries, books on the shelves of my local branch of the Calgary Public Library did not have dust jackets with illustrations like this one. So in taking Freddy the Pilot to read, I had no forewarning of the scene in which Freddy drops an umbrella parachutist team of skunks on a mission, and thereby hangs a tale. At the time, I was in grade 4 at Richmond School in Calgary. Its design was common in the early 50s, with a concrete play apron between the 2 wings. This is a modern photo. No trees back then. The grass is the start of the sports field. In my day, the far end of the sports field had no trees or houses. What we saw instead was a gentle rise of about 30 feet up to a plateau. Some months before I read Freddy the Pilot, we were out for morning recess in the early spring when we heard the sound of heavy aircraft engines. The noise came from a C-119 flying boxcar, a standard military transport aircraft of the day. The plane was heading west to pass over a small but spread-out army facility to the right on the plateau. Many of us went to the edge of the concrete apron to watch. Paratroopers began to emerge. The direction of the plane and the wind let them fall slowly to land on the army base. But one paratrooper was falling steeper and faster than the others. His parachute had not opened, was streaming out above him, was not slowing his descent. My dad was in the army. I knew the military called this a Roman candle, and I knew the parachutist would die. From the plane's altitude, this would have been a practice combat jump, with not enough time to open a reserve chute. My dad was at the drop zone. At supper that night, he said the jumper hit a frozen pond, bounced 30 feet, broke every bone in his body. And so, a few months later, when I read about Freddy dropping the skunk parachutists, it did not interest me. The next year, my dad invited me to watch another parachute jump. But when he came home to pick me up to go, I wasn't there. I was out playing with friends and had forgot all about it. Inwardly, I don't think I wanted to watch. Nor in the 30 years I spent later in the Canadian Army, regular and reserve, much of the time in the infantry, did I ever take a jump course. I felt no overt reluctance, just a lack of enthusiasm. Thank you very much.